The critical challenge of our times is fragmented and polarized discourse that threatens the better world our civilization has built based on Enlightenment principles. The New Enlightenment Project provides education on the enduring qualities of reason and compassion, which define humanism, and applies those principles to contemporary challenges. Today, I am pleased to interview humanist, activist, and publisher Scott Douglas Jacobsen. We will talk about his recent experiences in Ukraine, the war in Gaza, and about his experiences with humanist organizations, both domestic and international. I know you will enjoy listening to Scott's insights on these and other questions. Thank you for agreeing to this interview, Scott. First question, what is a Tobis Fellow and how did you get to become one?
A Tobis Fellow is in honor of an individual with that name. He basically devoted his life to various ethical pursuits. In fact, I believe his partner did too. It is at the University of California Irvine Ethics Center. That's the shorthand name for the institute. It's run by a distinguished professor, Kristen Monroe, who specializes in political science and ethics. So I interned there years ago when I was doing a series on women in academia for Insight, particularly the flagship journal for it was pretty much only interview based at that time. That was a time when I interviewed Mahtab Jafari, who is a professor at the University of California, Irvine, in pharmaceutical sciences. She's relatively well known at that institute, with some presence online as well. She recommended me to the Ethics Center. I got the position. At the time, it was Francisco Ayala Scholar for the internship title. And we were doing some analysis of some topics. And then we'd sort of collaborate amongst ourselves. And you'd have people who were doctoral students down to fresh students, so to speak, in the undergraduate level. Then that second level is Tobis Fellow, and that's a more sort of serious involvement for the year, but it typically culminates in a lot more active correspondence and research in the summer months, and that culminates in Tobis Day. So this year it's probably going to be somewhere in mid-June. Naturally, it'll be, as you know, less accessible during the next few months, but as June opens up, hopefully I'll be able to either attend virtually or in person, most likely virtually. Regardless, with some of the work that I've done for the Russo-Ukrainian War independently, I've collected the articles, the interviews done so far, as well as provided an introductory 3-minute video statement for the Ethics Center, so they could present that. In fact, that seems like it's going to be the case. So the Tobis Fellow sort of incorporates researchers into various ethical matters. At the time, it was started around my focus on women in academia, sort of looking at generational differences. The end goal is to turn that into a text through a university publisher. It's still ongoing, that first project, in fact. I had a lot of interviews with women in the academic system. However, at the same time, I pursue a lot of different paths. So they get complete as they get done. So the Ukrainian one is more immediate, so that took precedence. That's as the conversation evolves, I'm sure that'll become clear where certain things become more morally urgent or financially urgent or otherwise. So those tend to take up the focus. So the Tobis Fellow, it's an ethical fellowship that I earned through working my way up in that institute or that center. I'm in my second renewed year as a Tobis Fellow.
So if it's a reflection of your ethical approach to activism, would that be a concise description label?
That's fair.
Okay, well, let's pursue that a bit more. Now, you and I met when you volunteered to become a member of a national essay writing contest for humanist youth, which is that's a form of activism. I chaired that committee, and you subsequently became part of the Humanist Canada board. You've also been on the board of Young Humanists International. I believe you were vice president, were you not?
Yes. So there was a period of transition there. So at one time I was treasurer, then vice president, and then secretary general. The longest term was probably secretary general for Young Humanists International. And it was also all a piece of sort of finding out about not only the humanist ethos, but the local, the national, and particularly the international youth humanist community.
Okay. And while active with that organization, you were working on a policy on Indigenous rights. I recall that you talked to me about that at some length. Uh, when did you develop this interest? This is humanism applied to a wide variety of groups and constituencies. When did you develop this general interest in humanism broadly applied?
I wanted to find areas not explored as much in the humanist ethos, in the humanist international community. Some of those were obvious upon entering into it, and others were more kind of gradual. And then those two paths of finding out some right away and then seeing others gradually converged into certain themes of gaps in humanist discourse. So, as with a lot of these things, I simply decided to do them myself rather than dilly-dally, try to run through bureaucrats and get things going, simply to get the conversation rolling in some of these areas. And one of those happened to be Indigenous rights. Well, not necessarily Indigenous rights within the humanist community, because it's sort of implied in the humanist ethic with a focus on universal human rights. While at the same time, Indigenous representation was an issue, and Indigenous voices were an area of lack within the international humanist community. And so, interviewing those people, writing articles, proposing certain things to people who have Indigenous background, and getting involved where I can, but not sort of being preachy about it. Just simply doing the work, proposing things, and seeing where that leads. And naturally, a lot of failures with some successes, as with anything, and then proceeding from the failures, trying to capitalize on them, while also learning from failures.
And some of your volunteer activities have been with organizations that are not explicitly humanist. Like, for example, when you were with Athabasca University, I think you edited an online magazine, or at least you were working with that magazine. You've been involved as a volunteer with a national women's or feminist organization. Uh,
Yes.
Tell me about how you've helped organizations that are not explicitly humanist.
Sure. I mean, I take it this way. I have particular values. If an organization or an individual aligns with those values, I'll work with them, yet I don't have to necessarily be, you know, dogmatically connected to the institution. It's a mutual interest on common goals and then working towards those. So to advance those goals is to work through the organization. On individual projects, it is to do the same thing on an individual level without the limits of bureaucratic disagreements. And as with any organizational setup, I mean, humanist organizations have their disagreements. I mean, the only disagreements I've noticed within humanist organization leadership typically is personality based, and it's not really on the values. It might be on the individual leaders' ranking of the common values of what they consider more important or less important. So what is emphasized less, what is emphasized more, and that becomes sort of a personality clash typically. So when it comes to these other organizations, what was United Nations Women Canada and became the Almost Jawani Foundation. And for the Voice magazine of Athabasca University, I became involved in those through being in the milieu of the University of Athabasca with what was United Nations Women Canada and had transitioned into the Almost Jawani Foundation. I was emailing women's rights organizations asking about getting involved. I have some skills, I can contribute, I'll work for free. Ding, ding, ding. People think this is great. Free work from someone who can write and edit. Awesome. And that evolved into doing various things. We were doing research, writing speeches. One speech I wrote was supposed to be for Sophie Beauvoir Trudeau, ended up being for Miss Universe Canada of one of the recent years at that time, at least the first draft. Then even things like 3 a.m. Oh, I have to change my ticket from Istanbul to Toronto without a layover in Vancouver. I need a direct flight. Can you call Air Canada for me? Here's the information. I need you to reschedule. So it's $4,000 ticket to reschedule the flight so that it's saves for a couple hours. This kind of thing. Also, getting to know those personalities, you learn the algorithms they tend to be running either implicitly in how they think or explicitly in terms of how they behave. And it gives an insight into how to apply these in different areas. So that particular women's rights organization was based on doing a lot of writing and work and interviews in those domains. The one with the Athabasca University Student Magazine, I was mainly contributing. At one point, I was contributing 2 articles a week that boiled down to, in the end, interviews of like the president and others, and then into columns around education news in Canada, post-secondary education, and science news in Canada. And all those seem pretty much boilerplate humanism. Humanists care about human rights, women's rights are human rights, and humanists care about science and education, and those fit right in the ballpark with them. So there again, you have common values, common goals, mutual benefit. Let's proceed.
But it isn't always common values and common goals. I mean, what you're describing is a professional volunteer who helps people based on humanism, human rights, that kind of thing. Yet in one organization, things were said like, "You're a man, so you're slower. Men are trash. All men are crazy and possessive." What's it like to volunteer your time in that kind of environment?
That's also true. I mean, that those particular ones were in work environments which were blue collar, and I was the only man on site for the most part. And when it comes to those kind of statements, those work environments aren't the same ones as the organizational rights environments. So those statements come out of individuals who have an antipathy to a category, that category of man. Those individuals you're quoting, I know their history. They've had poor experiences, abusive or otherwise, probably mutually so in their intimate lives. Yet I don't think a generalized statement like that, a stereotype, matches any of my experience. I'm sure your experience either with men in general. Although, as with anyone, a man or woman or any category or group, you will find those types of individuals that treat people that way based on their sex, their gender, and so on. At the same time, if they do, they don't seem to count much as humanists or humanistic in any real sense. So those kind of statements or generalizations aren't based on a representative sample of the general population. They're based on a stereotype grounded in a trauma, typically. So those environments were when I was doing projects that weren't explicitly humanist. They were based on wanting to research some of the prominent industries in my home township, Langley, and those sexist statements did come out. Yet at the same, I think it's important to talk about those because they aren't talked about as much. And I think it's sort of it depends on the era and its focus. So I think we should combat all these forms of hate and such. Yet it becomes a little more difficult when those things are stated so explicitly, but commonly accepted. But they weren't in those rights-based organizations. Those were blue collar, highly blue collar, agricultural work environments.
Okay, well, thank you for explaining that, and I'm pleased that people who have been organizations for which you have volunteered haven't descended to that, and that this is more an attitude of some people, and you're being very understanding, I think, in saying, well, they have issues that they're working through, and so you're being understanding of their position rather than attacking back. Nonetheless, some organizations have attempted to use you. I recall one where a president of a humanist organization attempted to undermine another humanist organization and use you for that purpose. It seems like
Yes.
organizations that positions themselves as advancing human betterment do not always walk the talk. Is this a comment on the human condition that humanist organizations often end up fighting internally or between each other? Do you have any insights on that?
My entrance into humanist community was a first meeting where there was a huge disagreement on the western side of Canada over some drama that was happening in one of the provincial organizations. And it was really a fight. And I remember entering into that meeting going, what have I got myself into? And after talking with different humanists and different humanist organizations, not simply Canada, I'm talking globally, there is a trend for the same human problems that you get in other organizations in humanist organizations. So I think it's healthy to mention these things and to talk about these things. And I think coercion is in humanist organizations is different than in religious organizations in one respect. If you are in a religious institution with supernatural beliefs, and if there is coercion from the leadership to others who have less authority or are an elder in the community, they reference is the supernatural. So it's hard to make a concrete plan of accountability. In humanist organizations, we all have a common sets of understandings where you're dealing with people's problems, and interpersonal issues. You're not trying to excuse it to some divine moral law. You're dealing with an individual who was coerced, therefore there was a human rights abuse there. At the same time, I don't want to take this as sort of a victim talk from myself or from others. I want to be very understanding of the comparative advantage Canadians have, Canadian humanists have, and especially the global North humanists have, where the issues, there's personal disagreements, there's people trying to use each other occasionally. But a lot of the basics of life are provided. The humanist organizations have gone much further in the societies and in the institutions, and it's not dealing with things at the level of many global South humanists might be dealing with in terms of some of their organizational issues. I can only recall, for instance, two cases of financial bad dealings of humanists that came up. One was a guy who was asking for money from people who were giving him money. Turns out he was not a good person. And then another one where there was just a board member, an American organization. I haven't looked further into it, but the claim is that there was financial mismanagement, so to speak. Yet, that's just fine, man. No one's getting killed. No one's getting imprisoned. So there's a relative ranking here of the issues. And so in my case, the idea was to have me on the board and then to join the board of this publication or this publishing house, a small publishing house. And even though, the complaints this person might have had about this person, whether or not valid, that doesn't justify trying to state your job will be fill in the blanks. Because that person is in a power over position. If we're going to use that type of argument, then we have to be consistent about it. Yet, it's just took that as a strike against that person, and then I made a choice later on to reside from the board when there were second and third strikes. And I simply take it as that, and I don't want to be seen as a victim. I don't see myself as a victim. I see myself as very minorly victimized. I don't like forget it. I just take that into account. So I think we're better situated to deal with these things, and then to say this one is serious, this one is not, and the one that is not, we can more or less brush it off and get on with our lives. Whereas if you're Mubarak Bala in Nigeria, you're getting dragged from Kaduna to Kano, and the police officer broken into his home. They were not in uniform. They didn't have a warrant. They dragged him to a place where Sharia law is more in place. Now he's been in prison for over 1,000 days. Even with all this international outcry against it. There are writers with pseudonyms. As the vice president of the Atheist and Agnostic Alliance in Pakistan, Ayaz Nizami, as a pseudonym for Abdul Wahid. He's one of the cases, probably the only humanist cases for the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom. It's a bipartisan group. And there are 3 others that were also imprisoned. I've been following this case for years now. In, I think, through 2021 in January 8th, I think, he was given the death penalty. It hasn't been actualized, happily, yet he's still illegitimately put in for to those who don't have a religious adherence as an imaginary crime. So, the comparison isn't even close. It's not even the same sport. So we can state these things. We can acknowledge them. I can express them to colleagues and friends for mutual understanding, and also just for a sounding board of other people to say, yeah, that is wrong. That's not right that was done. Yet I don't want people to be, like the overweening, obsequious, supine liberal friend who, what can I do to help? I will do anything. That's also not good, because it infantilizes the other person, and in a way encourages a culture of victimhood, where it may be in quotes per victim, and the problem is with that, not in finding people who have been victimized and helping them out when necessary. It disempowers people from helping themselves out in many cases, and then when there are real victims of real traumatizing circumstances, the resources are being distributed over everyone. So it becomes a cost over the subset of those who are real victims, who have been victimized, who actually do need proper care. So I also want to keep it in perspective while acknowledging reality.
And looking internationally, that certainly does help us to keep perspective and be thankful for some of the things that we do enjoy here. Nonetheless, you mentioned religion, and you come from a very religious part of the country. You,
Not anymore.
Not anymore. Well, Fort Langley is only 20 kilometers from Surrey, and is that where's Trinity College anyway? You took these guys on, and a bunch of conservative religious guys attempted to cancel you. Tell me about it.
Yes. So I've written a lot about Fort Langley. It's not old Fort Langley. Old Fort Langley, as a National Historic Site, was known for farmers and hippies. That's the Fort Langley I grew up in. It was great. The newer brand over time has been with an increase in real estate prices and the influx of evangelical students and evangelical education through Trinity Western University. The population has changed. And so it's not to say everyone. It has made a change, and there's been development that changes the small character of that town too. So it's not totally unrecognizable, but sort of the feel is different of the town. At Trinity Western, to get some background for those who may not know, although many people in the humanist community probably know, the the Supreme Court case that was put up, they are the largest private university in Canada. Their denomination is Christian, specifically evangelical Christian. They are political. They have, for instance, the Laurentian Leadership Center in Ottawa. They would like to influence culture. There has been some research on them in that their theology appears to have become more conservative over time in a relative proportion to the more multicultural and liberal Canada has become. So it's not an action towards here are our selective literalist interpretations of some parts of New and Old Testament scripture to form our worldview. It's more a reaction to how the surrounding society is changing. So they want to be a bulwark for evangelical Christian theology. So they have a community covenant. In that community covenant, that's what got them in trouble originally. When they attempted to get a law school, they lost in BC, then they lost in Ontario, went to the Supreme Court of Canada, and some stipulations from that community covenant, which was mandatory for staff, faculty, administration, and students, had some things that were considered questionable to the Supreme Court of Canada and the lower courts about LGBTI plus people. So they lost the case for a law school, not 5-4, they lost 7-2. So it was an overwhelming loss for them. It was a big embarrassment in community. And then they were redlining a bit, I think, in their finances. So they opened up a Richmond campus that brought in more funds because they are private. Domestic students and international students pay the same prices. So a bachelor's degree might cost $120,000. That's approximately 3 to 4 times as much as an ordinary domestic student would pay in Canada. So the area has influenced along that theology, and they have been active up to the Supreme Court of Canada and the federal level. So knowing that community, I understand they see themselves as a very God's sort of people. At the same time, the students I tend to like quite a lot, actually. They're normal students. They have a worldview that doesn't, well, I understand it, that doesn't make a lot of sense to me. While at the same time, the administration tend to be the ones that put out these kind of ridiculous things like this community covenant. And if you talk to members of some of the LGBTI community, there is one subpopulation. They formed something called 1TWU. That is a sort of a community group for the LGBTI evangelical Christian community there. Yet they have to state they're not formally connected to the university. So it's sort of peripherally orbiting because the students are there, but they're not a formal associated organization. They are, para-Trinity, so to speak. They're part of the community, but not formally associated to the bureaucracy and institution of Trinity Western University. So the area with the rising property prices and the advanced education for evangelical Christians there, you probably could make an argument, given that they are the largest evangelical university and the rising costs of real estate there, they are wealthy in terms of how much money they have just in the equity of their homes. And they're highly educated, given the amount of time they've been there, it's a small town, and sort of the growth of that university. I mean, certainly it is a testament to the original president there. I think his name is Snyder. He was president more than any private, but longer than any private or public university president, something like 30 plus years. So this contiguous legacy that he established, and he didn't sink the university. So it's a testament to his ability as a bureaucrat to maintain and sustain growth of the university.
You also have an organization called Wagner Hills Ministries in your of the world, and you wrote that it's a Christian ministry that conducts itself within the evangelical Christian community in a unique way. How are they unique? What are they doing?
So they are a Christian recovery center. They have had some updates to like their website and their news and the social media output. For instance, the YouTube channel, they have more testimonies for people who've gone through it. Yet, I am suspicious of religious recovery programs, not merely the fact that don't adhere to a religion or any gods, but more to the fact that the success rate of other Christian recovery programs like Alcoholics Anonymous are very low. I mean, you are the expert here as the counseling psychologist, but as far as I know, religious recovery programs typically fail rather than succeed. So I become skeptical as a building upon the Alcoholics Anonymous skepticism based on some of the evidence that's been put out about them. Um, and then also on a moral level, there's two levels of analysis there at least. From the internal view for them, they are doing God's work to help people farm, read the Bible, pray, engage in community service for about a year at that particular institution. So they are helping people get sober, get off misusing substance and misusing alcohol. I mean, I think in general, most Canadians would agree, healthy use of substance or sobriety typically are healthier than addiction or substance misuse and alcohol misuse or alcohol and substance abuse, if you prefer that terminology. On the other analysis, they are giving people deliverance through Christ in their phraseology and imagery. From an outside view, and by outside I mean outside the Christian theological frame, you are having people being recommended to come to you, or doing outreach to get to people, or having advertisement for people to come towards you as a Christian ministry to make disciples, their term, who are in a weakened state of physically and mentally. So it seems as if to have people become disciples of Christ when they're in some of the most difficult circumstances many people will ever go through. I'm not speaking from a pedestal. I'm not a person who ever had addiction issues. My father is an alcoholic and has been a substance misuser. He is to this day. I haven't had major contact with him for maybe 8 or 9 years. So I saw that growing up. And so knowing how vulnerable people can be in those circumstances, it seems on that second level moral analysis, in fact, using what is seen as a public good for coercive purposes. That to me seems profoundly immoral, because you're not going to a person who is in a proper state, a healthy state of mind and body. You're coming to them when they're weak, and then you're closing them off for a year in that program. And that to me doesn't seem it seems using going for a good ends through questionable means and direction. Is that clear?
Yeah, it's what you're describing is a religious proselytizing form of ambulance chasing. Anyway, so you've taken them on, and you've also sparred with British Columbia's Homeopathic Society president.
So it depends on how much time I have or focus. And so sometimes I will take time to write, hopefully, a richer article. The Wagner Hills articles, to do that transition, the son of the founder, Helmut Baum, his son, Jeremy Baum, emailed me. He sent me the longest email I have ever received in doing this for over a decade now, over 10,000 words. And I ended up doing an interview with him to get some of his perspective, because I wanted to continue that conversation because my article was barbed, frankly. Yeah, and it did change some of my opinions. And with the Naturopathic Association of BC, the president of their organization did email me. That one, I didn't put nearly as much effort into as I did with the Wagner Hills one. The Wagner Hills one, I went through every online resource I could find. It was a serious project. For the Naturopathy Association of British Columbia, that one, that's not the proper order of the words for the organization, but it's the provincial organization for them. That was a light article. That wasn't nearly as serious. I was simply taking things that are pretty well known to be bunk or mixed up with a lot of bunk or woo, uh, and then just listing the organizations, writing critical commentary, and hopefully those are online as a caution for people who might be taken advantage of who might avoid more serious medical care. Um, uh, going online. So it's sort of like a small public announcement. Yes, she did email me long, and so I emailed that person, the president. I said I would email once. I have not heard from this person since.
But the president of the homeopaths in BC did accuse you of racism and arrogance. How did you respond to that?
Correct. She was stereotyping uh, people who of indigenous descent um, and of non-indigenous descent in a tricky way. I don't know if this is old or new. I mean, most things have happened before in terms of social phenomenon, in terms of how people relate to one another. Yet, if I recall, although memory's flawed, she was framing it as, in your terms, different ways of knowing. And it was something like that, where an individual who is of non-Indigenous descent can't understand uh, Indigenous like background or history and so on. And then she was espousing things that would probably be considered questionable medicine in the midst of doing so. Yet it's a tricky form of benevolent racism. I mean, in some gender studies, we talk about benevolent sexism, malevolent sexism. Malevolent racism is the most common reference, but it's not called that. It's things like blacks are inferior, things that are quite obviously racist. Um, the benevolent form of that is sort of positive framing of it, or the racism of assuming that there can't be conversation among people of different kinds of backgrounds, which within a humanist ethos, there's discussion, there's freer expression, there's ability to communicate experiences to one another, there's a way to bridge and have an understanding. That actually builds bonds. And to say then that an individual can't understand another's background because of their accident of birth in terms of ethnic background, that seems like a subtle form of racism to me. Now that wasn't the full argument. There was a more pointed argument. I think this was the reason for not getting an email back. But you have cited that I gave permission. I appreciate that. But it's also it's a very it's with Canadian history. Naturally, there's a sensitivity to a lot of these things. But when it's given so nonchalantly and blatantly thrown around with poor justification, especially on justification on non-science, I'm happy to take it on. I just
Well, it sounds like you became a journalist because you want to find out how people are thinking and what they're thinking and why they are thinking what they are thinking. You want to understand. Uh, would that be fair?
Yeah, I want to understand where other people are coming from. I mean, before I decided to make this crazy jump into a completely different field. I was in psychology. I was in 3 psychology labs, mostly one, but it was technically 3. And I mean, the apparently, you know this better than I would. The research appears to show men as maybe as big as a standard deviation difference with overlapping curves prefer objects. Women prefer people. I am interested in people. Um, I'm interested about how people operate in different circumstances, under pressure, under no pressure, interacting with a different culture, interacting with their own culture, this sort of thing. My emphasis when I was in psychology is more an interest in individual differences. So it is framing these sort of cultural, psychological phenomenon and these constructs we have about each other on an individual basis. So, if you ask any, Indigenous person from the over 600 bands we have in Canada, you're going to get a lot of differences of opinion, and I don't think it's healthy to sort of throw around generalizations. Well, at least a modicum of understanding, or at least an openness to making a change of opinion, unless you're colloquially making a casual conversation with someone. It's just everyone does that.
Yeah. So your objective is to understand, and it's more than that. You want to understand and communicate and share your knowledge. And so you set up a media empire that publishes 8 different magazines, such as African Free Thinkers and Insight interview-based journal, and you publish books. But unlike other media barons, you don't make any money at this because you basically
Yeah.
give it away for free. You're selling our
Yeah.
new book, Psychology in the Snow, on Kindle for $4.99. My dreams of living a healthy, wealthy retirement off our book sales are dashed. But it's harder on you because you've worked as a dishwasher and as a horse groomer to pay for all this. What makes it worth it?
I'll frame it this way, and I'll two corrections of fact. I was a dishwasher. That is correct. Actually, one correction is correct. I was not a horse groomer. I didn't get to that level.
Okay.
I was I would be considered something like a general ranch hand and a gardener landscaper. So a lot of cleaning stalls, cleaning buckets, filling buckets, feeding the different kinds of hay, feeding basic grain like alfalfa cubes for some of the horses. Um, Cleaning up around the barn, pine saw, hot water scrubbing the stall fronts and the inside of the stalls, uh, tractor operation, filling bins full of manure. Um,
You're
uh,
not
uh,
convincing
uh,
me, by the way, that your media empire is worth it. But keep going.
Hold on. So I frame this as a dual career track. On the one hand, there's the more practical side of life, and the other side is the more passion side of life. And on the practical side of life, things like working in restaurants. At the peak of that, I was working at Fort once, and then those 7 days a week, I was working as a janitor in 2 of them, also 7 days a week. So typically, by the end, it was a 2-year period. I would bring a backpack full of the different uniforms or aprons, and then I would just go, like, they were all like a block, this basically. And so I'd go from the bistro to the burrito place to the pub. And then I finished my shift at the pub, and everyone else would be playing pool and drinking beer and trying to hook up with someone. And then I would get on my janitorial closet equipment and get to mopping and sweeping and throwing in urinal cakes. And that transitioned into equestrianism because I wanted to do a couple things. One, I wanted to understand that community, because Langley, British Columbia, Canada, is considered the horse capital of British Columbia. So I was also tired of the restaurants. I wanted to try as much out as I could in those areas. Also, I come from a lower income home, an alcoholic home, so you just have to make your way. So I sort of decided to get a little more practical in life and just writing. So the restaurants are part of it. You have to start somewhere. And then I decided to transition into equestrianism because those 2 former reasons. Nice transition, horse capital of BC. I was reaching out to different places. I happened to hook up with a family who happened to run the largest competition grounds in British Columbia, probably the 3rd largest, I think, in North America, at least the 3rd ranked in North America. And I lived at the farm. I worked at the farm. I was there 7 days a week. Sometimes the days are 15 hours long. It's a little bit weird with the pay because they'll pay you per stall, and then they'll pay you hourly. And there's certainly a security and income there. There's always horses always poop. You're always going to be cleaning stalls. but that get the per stall gets translated into hourly, and so I mean, I think the most that I got translated into hourly in one biweekly was something like 254 hours of work. And so it's tremendous amount of work. And then in the mornings and the evenings around those hours, I'd be continuing the writing. And so this dual career track is that practical side is described, followed by the more passion side. The passion side has certainly been a lot longer, where I've been doing interviews, just in various media, picking up internships. Hey, can I write for you? I find what you're doing interesting. I think I can help out here. And that snowballs over time. And also that period in the farm gave me some time to just sit and archive everything, because I'd seen publications go kerflooey over time. And so I cataloged them all. And as far as in terms of just outlets and websites, it's like the blog and the website, for instance, on like a fashion website, they would be over 100 outlets at least, in terms of publication outlets. And if you take republications and publications of articles and interviews, I can't do a precise reduction of those that are published of other people's, but maybe 6,000 or 5,000 of my own over that 10 plus year period. And a lot of those naturally have been interviews, because that's what I enjoy doing. But my goal when I started this in 2012 was to not make much or any money off it. The goal was public domain, public service, because I did not want to have that conflict of interest. Obviously, you could see I had done the Tri-Council policy statement training at the time. So this is, for those who don't know, that's the training ethics you need, which is not very long when you are working with human subjects or participants now in psychological laboratory experiments. And that can be as simple as someone walking into a room. We were focusing on auditory hindsight bias at the time, and then we would test certain things around that particular cognitive bias. And so I didn't want to have that, and that was a hard choice. It doesn't make life easier, but I think in terms of that passion project, which is what drives it a lot of the time, it was the right thing to do. I'm surprised in my 30s that I made that decision in my early 20s. I can't believe I had the gumption to even try that. Because I remember seeing some other undergraduates, I think it was 3 or 4 of them, were bright guys, and one girl who were forming their own magazine, but they did 1 issue. And I was like, I can do that. And because I was thinking at the stop, why doesn't anyone just do this? And I realized it's a hell of a lot of work. It really is. And also make a distinction between what is mine and what is not. So most of the outlets I have written for are not my own. Some are sort of still forming because there hasn't been a formal issue, like the one you mentioned before, African Freethinker. That one is based around just the trials I've heard African non-religious people have to endure. Even take like the work of Dr. Leo Igwe. He has the organization now, Advocacy for Alleged Witches. That's not like a fun thing they do on, among a group of sort of hipster Europeans, North Americans. That's a real problem. Mothers will throw battery acid on their sons because they think they're possessed. Old women will be beaten to death by the village because they think they're possessed. And this has been Talia Chinama and Leo Igwe and others. They have noted this to me as an issue across the continent. And they're dealing with a more difficult circumstance, not just poverty. They're dealing with a lack of education resources around that. And we dealt with a lot of European Christian colonialism. They're dealing with a different circumstance where they're dealing with the pre-colonial superstitions, plus they're dealing with European Christian colonial leftover superstitions, plus Arabic Muslim leftover colonial superstitions. It's a whole mess that will take time to sort of overcome, and it's a much more difficult circumstances. And so I can provide an outlet for some of them who just don't have a lot. One of the people that I'm most impressed with, who no one really seems to know about, is a guy from Tanzania who formed Jiko Jipya or Think Anew, was a guy named Insajigo Insasam. And he's just thrilled to have any, articles of his published. Right now, he's been stuck in a lawsuit for a while there, but it's cases like those that are important. Places like Canadian Atheist or the Good Men Project or News Intervention, those I don't own. There was a confusion from some correspondence I got as if I owned those or ran them. I wrote and edited for them. I did not own them. And this entire enterprise, it's been going on for over a decade. These are experimental because they are not financially backed. Right now, it's still running through one person mainly. With some of the funds I've gotten through just literally shoveling shit, has helped me hire one lady to help with sort of the excess of transcriptions. And I went through 30 people until I got someone who I thought was decent enough that I could work with what they gave me and give it as a final product with some finalization of edits. So this quote, empire, unquote, is certainly striking back to make a Star Wars joke at some of the purveyors of nonsense and bullshit who are bold enough to send me emails on things that are basic fact. I think it's important to push back against those types of people. And I didn't cover the 27 dads over a satire I wrote emailed me. Or sorry, they didn't email me. They emailed bosses of mine. One of the Good Men Project. Then they emailed the Canadian Association of Journalists, where I'm a freelance independent journalist in good standing, and the University of California Irvine Ethics Center, where I'm a Tobas Fellow. And they basically were defaming me. So I wrote a satirical article about them because they were doing ridiculous things. And there was one woman who dissented, saying instead of like forming a vigilante crew of dads who have their dogs in camo uniform and black, we should try social services, because most criminals that get back out and go in, they're recidivist. So deal with the problem at the root through social services rather than demonizing this person, especially in Fort Langley. It's one of the safest places, Langley, in Canada. Fort Langley is one of the safest places in Canada for sure, on top of that. Also, it's Canada. It's one of the safest countries in the world. And so these petty little crimes, which is mainly stealing alcohol and food and stuff for a person who was unhoused, seemed ridiculous because you had 27 dads that organically formed. They're in communication with the RCMP officers and everything. And so it was obviously satire. One, the hyperbole. Two, I was exaggerating for humor to point out how ridiculous this was. Three, I was making up associations names like, something like the Men in Black and Camouflage Crusaders movement, Dad's Dogs and Co. They literally read that and thought this was news. And then they sent this, and then they said, "You're defaming us." They sent this to my bosses. They said this is religious hate, blah 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 blah. As it turns out, within a couple correspondence letters sent to them, my bosses, they understood the situation. They wanted to take it down because their feelings were hurt. Okay, so these were men probably aged 40 to 70. They were probably conservative given the town and the orientation on law and order. I'm not against law and order. I'm not making a political argument here. And from a religious town. So probably a decent number of them were religious, Christian particularly, given the heritage of this country and the heritage of European heritage, religious heritage of European heritage people in this country, as well, statistically given the area, they're mostly going to be evangelical. So, and those populations, surprisingly, have been the most thin-skinned and humorless populations that I've had to not deal with, just sort of respond to in correspondence and otherwise. It's been interesting because you'd think if they're more established in life, they don't really have any problems, they're living in a good area. And so they have to come up with these antics about, vigilante hunting down a guy who's a drunkard and unhoused and does petty crime. And I corresponded with that one woman, actually, because I live in that town. She sent me an email saying thanks. And she's like, "Oh, they've been going after me too, and my law firm." She's a lawyer. So obviously, this was not about this the article, even when it was explained as satire. It was about someone dissenting in town.
So, so,
Um, and not
so they go after, they identify people they're going to go after, and then they go after them. They find a pretext. You're saying that your article was a pretext. It wasn't the issue.
in a way, I mean, it's also it's something that we're seeing more prominent now in terms of bad activism. Um, that leads to some cancellation of people. It has to do with the difference of Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, even Louis Farrakhan, as leaders of people who matter to them, and they matter to those people. It's that in contrast to one or two individuals who come forward and say we represent these 27 dads. That's what they claimed. So their feelings were hurt because of the satire. I took down the article to respect their feelings. I have not heard from them since. Uh, Yet, it's that balance between freedom of expression and compassion. And is it really worth it in terms of the headache? Not every time. Uh, for one, it was a nonsense article, satire, on a non-issue. A bunch of dads getting together, feeling good about themselves with their camouflage and their black fucking pants and shirts and dogs going after a guy, and they feel really good. And according to that woman, anything that was not depicting them as heroic was immediately demonized. So um, that's been the issue, and that's not a one-off. That's happened a lot. The difference in this one was I actually saw the correspondence. It was sent to me. This has been happening since 2017, 2016, when I was writing for Canada's News. It was run by editor-in-chief Benjamin David, who's since gone into some area of finance or economics research. Um, Publication that's gone kerflooey. I wrote maybe 300 or so articles for that particular publication. It was British. And that was introducing me more to the international humanist community, especially where they're more established, like the United Kingdom. Interviewing people like Stephen Law and Jim Al-Khalili, and Rebecca Goldstein, and people of note in the humanist circles, intellectual circles. So that's when I started getting this type of stuff, and I didn't know what was said. Then I started seeing some impacts on like boards and publications, and certainly they have had some effect, but not much. Um, but I haven't seen what was said until recently with these 27 dads, and it's not necessarily them every time. That would obviously be untrue. It would be the character of what is said, and the irony of it. A satire is claimed as defamation, but obviously that wasn't the main issue. But let's take that as the claim. In a satirical or jocular context. Then, without CCing me, when my email is publicly available easily, and even in the copy paste image that they gave, they send it to three professional associations or one or two employers to defame me in a serious context. So I leave it to listeners. What is more serious? Uh, uh, Claim defamation in a satirical context, or actual defamation in a serious context? And I think that more or less answers itself. And that's been an issue. But that comes with doing independent journalism, I think, where you can speak your mind more freely and fully in a lot of contexts, especially when you're challenging taboos of a Western kind of culture, which is to say, a softer culture, because a lot of basic needs aren't survival anymore.
Okay, so now you're surmising that these counselors are conservative based on what you know of their background and where they're from and the kind of arguments they used. I'm guessing that Kim Campbell is a different sort of conservative. You interviewed her.
Ah,
She's the
yeah, sure.
only
Yes.
female Canadian Prime Minister ever. Would you comment on her approach to life? From what I know, and I've never interviewed her, but from her public persona, I would have guessed that she would not have fit in with these other conservatives. What do you think?
Yeah, I don't think she is that. I to, to her, she is in the interview an alert person. I mean, it's been a while, uh, so I don't, people's mental acuity decreases with age. When I was interviewing her, she was entirely acute, aware of the situation. Um, and it was a good interview. With regards to that, I don't know. I would probably lean, it's not necessarily a hard argument, but on the idea that, if a culture is becoming more cosmopolitan over time, then maybe if one stays one type of conservative in terms of their valuation of what matters in life and to a society, they can seem more and more liberal because the culture has shifted, but their dial has stayed the same or relatively similar. And that could be one of the effects. So she wouldn't necessarily fit in with that group. Also, she's a leader, and leaders don't typically, think in terms of necessarily joining the group. They want to rile up the group. And this dad situation, which again is a non-issue. It's water under the bridge after a couple of days for me. I think it was more probably mob mentality. It's kind of gathering together individuals claiming to speak for them. It's probably one to save face for them, saying, "Look, guys, I got this taken down. I did the right thing by all of us." And good for them if that's sincere, I guess.
What did you learn from the Paul Martin interview?
It wasn't what it depends. It wasn't what I learned from the Paul Martin interview in and of itself in the same way it wasn't what I learned from the Kim Campbell interview in and of itself. It was what I learned in relation to them over time and then reflecting on those two particular interviews. What I learned from those two interviews in reflection as a relation to one another as national leaders. These are not idiots. These are smart people. They know how to lead. They may have different uh, ethical emphases that make political positions and social positions different than one another and different than other people. It doesn't mean they're stupid. It means that it's different, so their values are different, so they will pick different things as greater emphasis. That's it. So what I learned is after they retired, quote unquote, they didn't really retire. Uh, Paul Martin formed an initiative. Kim Campbell started focusing on issues important to her. Paul Morton was focusing on the empowerment in practical terms of Indigenous people in the Canadian context. And Kim Campbell was focusing on more women's rights. At least the conversation was focused on women's rights in that context. So the lesson to me from them, which was instilled by very old people when I was 14 and 13, when they were my friends in my town, when it was hipsters and farmers in Fort Langley, uh, is that uh, you don't stop. 65 is an arbitrary number, and you may become even more busy when you retire than when you had a quote unquote job that paid the bills and gave you a decent standard of living. In fact, they seemed busier than ever, and many of them more what I would consider wise old people who I knew and raising my town. They didn't stop. So the idea is to pick something, one that will outlive you, and two, to never stop. It doesn't mean crush yourself. It means challenge yourself to think of the long term. And that's something that I've taken on board since I was probably a teenager. And so they reemphasize that at a national level, federal level.
What did you think of Elizabeth Loftus? Well, I should preface. I'd like to preface this. She's a personal hero of mine. Not that I have had long conversations with her. I think I met her once at a conference. But I was director of mental health in northern Saskatchewan in the 1990s when some daycare operators in a community not in my area but north of Saskatoon were charged with sexual assault following the statements of several children. With further questioning, the stories of ritualized sexual abuse and satanic rituals became more elaborate, and a policeman was drawn in, and he was suspended pending an investigation. And eventually, the kids, their stories talked about shape changers, daycare operators turning into birds and flying away. And at that point, the investigators decided that perhaps their stories were more allegorical than factual. Uh, that was a craze that swept North America, as you may recall. There were people charged. A lot of daycare operators were charged, but also others in what was described as satanic ritual abuse, and uh, one couple from Texas finally got released from jail, given DNA evidence that pointed to their evidence. There's a husband and wife team they'd served 14 years.
That's horrifying.
Loftus blew that whole
Yes, she did.
operation, that whole schema apart by with her research into how false memories can be formed and easily implanted with the use of leading questions. So that's why she's a hero of mine. Give me your impression of her, since you had coffee with her a couple of times.
I interviewed her. I've had coffee with her a few times. She invited to me to one of her talks that was on the campus of the University of California, Irvine, when I was there visiting. I didn't have time, so I couldn't attend. Yet I'm aware of her primarily due to the work in psychology. That work was for a Tier 2 Canada Research Chair lab, the Lifespan Cognition Lab of Dr. Daniel Bernstein, who I love to pieces, has been a wonderful mentor in so many ways. So I want to give a shout out to Dr. Daniel Bernstein. Thank you. And he connected me to Loftus, and I ended up getting that original interview. And she was in the first issue, potentially, or second issue of Insight that got some of the ball rolling. She was one of the first big interviews. One of the other ones was Dr. Hawa Abdi, who was a Nobel Peace Prize nominee from Somalia. She has since passed away. Her daughter still lives, though. And although I mean, we could do a Loftus joke. I mean, how I remember it, it may not necessarily be so. So she is primarily known for false memory and rich false memory research. Obviously, she's part of the skeptical community, or skeptic community, through the Center for Inquiry, or the Committee for Skeptical Inquiry. She's been part of that community of people who really do invaluable work and just tackling bullshit through proper education. And she's such a pleasant person too. I mean, she's not. There's very few people I've met in like the skeptic community who are assholes. I mean, you want to interview James Randi, who's an entirely pleasant person. And my image of her is someone incredibly hardworking, in fact, a workaholic by her own admission. In fact, everyone who I know who doesn't even mention her name but references someone they know at the University of California, Irvine in psychology, who's a woman that's a workaholic, they're referencing her. And it shows not only in the quality of her work, but in her citations. She's an incredibly cited psychologist. In fact, when I was looking at the listing, at least in the 2010s, at some period, she was the single most cited woman psychologist in psychological history. She is an incredibly important psychologist, entirely humble, that I would just happen to be at University of California, Irvine. One time I visited a friend who had cancer, so I stopped by and I said, "Hey, uncle, hey, hey, Dr. Loft, this is so and so from back in whenever. Would you like to go for a coffee? She said, sure. And so two or three times I'd go. I'd meet her at her office, and we'd go get a coffee at the little, administrative area, and just talk it up. Talk about Danny, who she knows, and it was a wonderful experience. And so she's very down to earth, incredibly hardworking, and she had to be tough. She had to have support in the ability to, as far as I know, make a transition from one university to another because the attacks were quite vicious. Yet it shows the power of the scientific method applied firmly in a public case or set of cases can make sure innocent people aren't harmed more than they could have been otherwise. Her work is incredibly important. And also, it shows the truth to that Neil deGrasse Tyson statement that we are terrible data-taking devices. Do not rely on your memory, even in spite of the fact that the memory may have a lot of valence, strong valence to it, or a lot of emotional value to it. It doesn't necessarily matter how strong the emotion is attached to a memory to make it feel true. It doesn't necessarily mean it's true. In fact, it may have no impact on whether it's true.
Yeah, I came across some things I wrote when I went to university in 1969, and I came across some notes that I wrote. I read them. I was convinced that the contents of them couldn't have been what I wrote. I would never write something like that, but the handwriting was the same. So
Shit,
some things do
that's
say.
funny.
Recently, you traveled through Ukraine, and I believe you started from Moldova, and then went to Odessa, and from there almost to Kherson, didn't you?
Almost.
Almost to
So
Kherson.
there's some asterisks. There's some asterisks there. So how you define travel to is the it depends part of that. So um, so that all started actually probably back in Iceland and getting involved with the youth humanist community. Coming back in Copenhagen, you and I met there. Victoria Guggenheim, Rosalind Moule, the Igwe, Andrew Copson, Gary McClung, all these huge names, like people who I love dearly and are all my heroes for the incredible work that they do, and which deserves more attention. Um, that the two keynote speakers there, as you know, were Remus Chania from Romania and Alexandra Romantsova from Kyiv, Ukraine. Remus Chania may have founded or was a co-founder of the humanist movement in Romania. He was a member of parliament. He was part of the Green Party. He's been involved in activism there for a long time. More recently, he's been involved in independent war correspondence work through Newsweek Romania. Um, and his keynote really was inspiring to see because it's not an easy thing to say. I'm going to go to a war zone purposefully with no institutional backing or minimal institutional backing. It's a very interesting thought pattern, I think. So the other person was Alexandra Romantsova. She's Ukrainian. She's the executive director of the Center for Civil Liberties in Ukraine. It is based out of Kyiv, which is one of the westernmost cities in Ukraine. However, the front line is enormous. So it's hard to say how safe you are necessarily because it's still in drone or missile range. She through that organization and other people who were involved in that work, they won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2022. It is the first one that Ukraine has ever won. And so that was also, again, an inspiring talk that she gave. So being how I am, I decided to interview them on site, and those were fascinating. And so Remus actually proposed the idea. I said this in the interview to the Central London Humanists. 100% credit to Remus for the idea. It's insane. I said, let's do it. So this started in August of 2023 in terms of the planning. I was still working at the farm. I was working 7 days a week. I barely got any time off. So I had to find out a way to get 2 weeks off. So if my old bosses are watching, I'm sorry. For what I'm about to say, we planned from August till November. I left on November 22nd. I had to get surgery. I won't say what, but since I had to get surgery, well, the doctor says I got to take 2 weeks off. So why don't I just take 2 weeks off and then I can go to Ukraine? So I combined the two, surgery followed by 2 weeks off. But a full 2 weeks means the surgery of that day. And travel is going to be long because you can't travel straight into Ukraine. You have to go to Kashina, Moldova, as you mentioned earlier, and then you bus in. And then you have to bus out. So you have to calculate that round trip, which is much longer than flying straight in. You can even see this in flight pattern maps around Ukraine for the fear of getting
So,
shot
so,
down. So,
so your
yeah.
convalescence involved going to a war zone, or as close to a war zone as you could get. What was your impression of the war and the Ukrainian people that you met?
Sure. So I was kind of on painkillers a lot of the time, and we were sleep deprived, but tough people due to circumstance. I don't think it's in the genes of being Ukrainian to be tough. I think it's a resilience built over at least an approximation of maybe 20 to 22 months at that time for them in a war. And I was probably certainly the wimp of that whole community because I got the surgery in the morning on the 22nd and went straight to the airport and then off I went to Ukraine, landed in Chisinau through Ramos and I met. We bused into Odessa. Then we went to Mykolaiv. We went from Mykolaiv to almost Kherson. However, we got stopped at the last checkpoint and turned around because even with a military press pass, you can't go there for that reason. Then we went back to Mykolaiv. From Mykolaiv, we went to Dnipro, from Dnipro to Kharkiv, and then all the way back from Kharkiv to Kiev, and then we went back to Chisinau in Moldova. And that whole trip gave an impression of the different cities, the different conditions of the cities, and how richer and poorer cities deal with these circumstances. Especially going to Kherson, seeing how a war-torn territory looks, just everything's abandoned, falling apart, bombs everywhere. And everyone has to deal with more or less a curfew in many cities, say between 11 and 5. So it changes their whole routine of their life. There is an apparent informal policy of terrorizing the public in the mornings when they are under curfews, so they know they're going to be home, of when the drones and the missile strikes will hit, if they're farther than the artillery lines, the front line can hit. So area alarms go off every night. If you're not used to it, you certainly are sleep deprived. If you're traveling all the time, it's a new city every day and a half or two, certainly sleep deprived. And people, it's strange. Ramos told me, okay, we're going to be going into Ukraine now. And I knew the United Nations had stated nowhere is entirely safe in Ukraine when you go in there. And he said, things will seem normal for about a day. Then you'll realize things are actually not quite okay. And you realize this. One of the quintessential moments was at the school where there was a huge firefight. I didn't know it was a firefight, but there were a lot of soldiers that were killed at the school because it was around a main road line that Russians could have supplies run through. Paved roads, these are run artillery gun and tanks and armored vehicles. So if you look at the back of it, the playground was intact, the track was intact, the school was completely demolished, completely demolished. So we went inside, took pictures and saw everything. And you take a picture of it, you see this weird situation where this mother is walking her child in a stroller around the track that's intact. School's completely destroyed. And we're taking pictures, and he's doing his TikTok for his online audience. And she's still walking around the track. An air raid alarm goes off. She doesn't flinch. It's this weird, surrealist situation, which was entirely accurate to what he was describing, of a world seemingly normal, but not normal at all. Under what circumstances do you see a blown out school, which is falling apart as we're inside of it, and a woman is walking her child around in a stroller of a running track at a elementary school, and the air alarm is going off? Yeah, And we were sitting at a coffee shop, and they were playing, Dean Martin, Frank Sinatra. They were playing Christmas music. At any time, a missile could hit, and that's it. I mean, certainly it's a more pleasant way to go, and we're all going to go at some point. Yet it's a surrealist experience. People are dealing with, reduction of standard of living by a long shot. I mean, any hotel or food, it's all far cheaper in those circumstances. So people are dealing with reduced standard living, not necessarily a fear, but an understanding death could happen that day. But say 8 people die or 3 people die every day in that city or every other day. The chances are that within the calculation relative to the total population of that city, there's a chance. It's small, but you just know, yeah, this could be my last day. And we knew that going in that context that, yeah, certainly we could be killed going into there. If you do to go to the front lines where not only missiles and drones can strike with drones with ordnance or missiles in general, for missiles in particular, since they're traveling at a supersonic speed, you don't hear it. You would just vaporize. The artillery, it must travel subsonic because I was told if you hear drop to the ground, or if you see me drop to the ground, drop to the ground, because then the actual artillery shell will catch up with the sound and then explode. So you reduce the risk of, unless it lands on you, you're automatically dead. But if you can dodge what comes up out of the ground in terms of the shock wave and debris, you can reduce the amount of damage that might be done to you. So you come into that context knowing people at the equestrian facility I was working at were trying to think of ways to stop me from going, literally. I found this out after. So it was quite interesting, but some things you just have to go ahead and do them.
You certainly have an unusual way of convalescing. Shifting just slightly, last month, almost the day that you published our book, you published on Israel, Palestine, based on a series of interviews you had with a number of UN officials, special rapporteurs, and others who are expert on that theater. And you conducted these interviews from 2019 to 2021. The book comes across as pro-Palestinian. How did the events of October 7th affect your views?
Certainly with October 7th, it was a terrorist attack against the civilian population. Yeah, there is a long understanding within the international community of human rights violations, human rights abuse against the Palestinian people. And I think there is some good reportage sort of making the distinction that this is not Israel versus Palestinians right now. It's Israeli-Hamas war. And certainly, I mean, this is killing 200 people. This is clearly an act of terrorism. It is a violent act and deserves condemnation. It's more in terms of a ratio and a long-term image of that particular war, at least within the frame of reference of those who have a lot more expertise than me that actually were UN Special Rapporteurs, or for instance, with Omar Shakir being the Human Rights Watch Director for Israel Palestine. The human rights abuse happens bidirectionally in terms of Palestinian organizational terror against Palestinian civilians and vice versa. The ratio appears to be much more human rights abuse by Israelis, or at least the Israeli government and IDF forces against Palestinians than the reverse. Yet, of course, Palestinians have been committing human rights abuse against Israelis too. Naturally, given the extent and length of that conflict, and that what the UN terms the question of Palestine, one would need to do extensive articling or sort of precise topic interviews, as was done, to analyze those types of human rights abuse. Yet I think it's important that we work, for instance, as humanists, to maintain that those human rights standards are maintained and accountability is held. Whether it's October 7th attacks or killing of civilian children and journalists.
Well, certainly October 7th was was something that, uh, as a psychologist, it affected me, because here we had women being raped and tortured and their bodies desecrated and paraded in Gaza and spat upon, and children were beheaded, and uh, uh, it was well organized. People, civilians, mostly civilians, were being murdered. Uh, it it's similar of the historical accounts that I've read of, say, the 1929 Arab uprising, where again you had 1,100 people, Jews mostly, murdered or seriously injured. And some of the examples: a baker was his head was shoved into into his oven, and the oven was lit. A rabbi had his skull was split and his brains were scooped out with a spoon. This is horrific, and psychologically it means, hey, people in October 7th, the terrorists were taking selfies of themselves and sharing it with their families. They were proud of doing this kind of thing. I found that incredibly shocking. How do you contextualize that?
It contextualizes on its own terms as this is terrorist offense. This is human rights abuse. And I think this matters to humanists. If we're taking October 7th in and of itself, we're talking about a slaughter of innocents by people who committed a terrorist act. If you take a larger perspective, then it's contextualized in a longer history of human rights abuse. But that's such a massive conversation that in many of these interviews that are done, it's typically sort of accusatory, condemnatory, rather than sort of going with, okay, what tends to be the longer term human rights record on that, and it's always messy to sort of say, well, this many people were killed here and that people were killed there and this they're killed. Fundamentally, human rights are being abused through the degrading of people, through the murdering of people, and October 7th is no different than other categories of offense.
Getting back to Ukraine, the 1919 pogrom in Poskoriv, I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right, resulted in the deaths of 1,000 Jews. In all, 100,000 Jews were murdered in Eastern and Central Europe during the interwar period. You're working to make the world a better place. We want to make the world safe. How do we make the world safe for the world's Jews? What's your prescription?
We combat anti-Semitism in the way we combat other forms of racism, basically. Whether it's institutional or whether it's individual. We don't want to use that as a bludgeon to excuse other abuse, by states. Because typically, most of the bad mass things typically done are the organized groups or states, and so I think in terms of combating anti-Semitism, we combat it in the same way we combat other forms of racism through organization, through interfaith or interbelief rather, communication and dialogue and activism. That latter one is incredibly underrated, in the sense that if you understand your neighbor is just another person who eats and poops and and sleeps and has a family likely similar to your own with a different flavoring, it helps to humanize them. And I think that's really the heart of sort of a humanist orientation on life. It's similar to some of the original queries that you're giving around, why the focus on some of the indigenous stuff. I think it's a similar orientation around, just building a view of people that, yeah, they're just like pretty much everyone else with a different cultural flavoring. And one of the more recent projects I've been working on, which is going to be long term, but it's sort of happening on and off, is looking at indigenous freethinkers. It's a difficult subject to some, but it's entirely underrepresented in terms of sort of the humanist investigatory repertoire. And what I'm gathering in general, they're saying more or less, sort of non-believer indigenous people, the same things non-believer, non-indigenous people say about community. It's hard. I have to explain myself more. It makes living in community a little more difficult. I don't believe in the beliefs. I don't believe in the God concept of creator. I don't believe in supernatural orientations around what is happening in community service or ritual. However, I grew up in this community. I like this community. The reservation is where my family is. I like taking part in ceremony. I like taking part in smudge ceremonies. I like taking part in certain prayers. They don't mean anything to me in terms of veracity. They mean something to me in terms of valence, in terms of my emotional connection to community, my past, and so on. And it's sort of there's multiple ways to approach people who have fundamentalist or religious community. And certainly one of the most prominent ones of the 2000s and the 2010s was sort of a new atheist, a firebrand atheist approach, where you confront and challenge these assertions head on with sort of a frame of reference that is empirical and scientific, where they don't hold any water. And that was extremely important in sort of normalizing a lot of free thought. And then there are other strands of orientation and approach to sort of getting that message across that are along the spectrum that are softer. And one of those is, as I found with Lena Tebla, who is Sami, as a European indigenous, or Brett Michael Davids, who's a film score composer in the United States, who's Munsilini Lenape. And for him, it's being in community, but also taking part in some of those rituals and so on. It's enjoyable, but he doesn't believe in any gods. He's an atheist. They don't adhere to these supernaturalistic entities or categories. They don't mean anything to them, to the original point in terms of veracity. And I think it's similar in terms of humanizing people in that same sense. It's difficult, more difficult in sort of the anti-Semitism category and anti-Arab sentiment category, because for one, it's one of those issues that gets mixed up with the political conflagrations between occupied Palestinian territories and the Israeli government. And also because the indigenous voices aren't talked about as much or as prevalent on the international stage, especially in the humanist community too. So to combat anti-Semitism and that sort of thing, it's important to sort of combat it in the same way you would anything else. I see historical like events that were obviously terrible. Yet in terms of the process of combating it institutionally, governmentally, and then probably the most effective is community organizing and humanization of people. That helps.
Well, we attended the recent World Humanist Conference in Copenhagen, and you and I met at the hotel bar the night before the conference began, you'll recall, and I had difficulty having a conversation with you because people from different parts of the world kept coming up to you and wishing you well. And I think that's a testimony of what we've just been talking about. Your project here is to increase understanding, find that amplify those voices so that other people who have a different understanding can perhaps begin to understand the other. And so I want to thank you for this interview. You've certainly made out a lot of friends, and that's, I think, a testimony to your approach to not just life, but your specific approach to journalism. Thank you.
You too. Appreciate the opportunity.
New Enlightenment Project is committed to increasing civil discussion of difficult or controversial topics, such as the one we've just had with Scott Douglas Jacobsen. We offer a series of podcasts to further that aim. You can visit our website at nep-humanism.ca, where you can browse our blog, watch more interviews in this series, become a member, or make a donation. We are also on Facebook. You can subscribe to our podcasts and webinars at YouTube at nep-humanism.